The Martians. Chapter 28. After several days the crew had rested enough from the shorter shifts, and Mark had healed enough to move about with less pain than absolute agony, so the welcome back to Hermes party was held. It had been planned for immediately after Victoria I's arrival, but due to Mark's absence, injury and recovery it had been delayed. This time the meal was smoked brisket from Lewis's favorite place in Houston, along with sealed in plastic drink bags red wine from California and beer from St. Louis. Mark took this opportunity to return the property of Oz-3 that he had rescued and carried from the hab, as well as the stones he had collected for them and their loved ones at KK. Lewis had polished these and made it clear that they were not logged as specimens and that the crew was to keep them. Beth knew her hoodie was coming but wept with happiness at the thoughtfulness anyway, and Rick was overjoyed at the return of his crucifix and water bottle, as was Alex at his children's photos. Alex had already replaced them on another laptop but appreciated the thought and claimed many could never have been replaced. Chris put his watch on his wrist with a simple thank you and a misty-eyed look at Donna, who simply smiled. Mark suggested with a grin that Rick use the water bottle for his beer, and Rick looked to be considering it until Lewis practically shouted no, and explained that when Mark was injured, he needed a relief bottle and nothing else was handy and... "You peed in it. You bastard!" Rick shouted with a grin. "Wait, it wasn't his fault. I didn't have anything else to use, and, well, I washed it out. Several times. Myself." Missy laughed. "Well, so you know, I was never going to use it to drink anyway. See, ever since I was a kid when I camped, I always brought back a little dirt in a jar, and whenever I've traveled, I've done the same. I must have 100 jars of dirt so. So, you thought you would sneak back a little Mars soil as a personal souvenir against all NASA regulations?" Mindy asked with a smirk, as she held up the beautiful opal and olivine samples Mark had given her. "Well, I'm shocked. I would never allow that. Commander Parks, please take that bottle from Commander Martinez. That reminds me, Dr. Watney, you remember on, I think it was day 19, you had that sample contain a rupture. If it hasn't all leaked out from the vibrations of the ride to KK, that water bottle would just about hold it perfectly, don't you think?" She grinned. "Sample contain a rupture, what?" "Oh, you know, I think it would just fit. But, I know, you think it would be a violation of NASA rules to seize an astronaut's property. So once you have the sample in it, give it back to Rick. It's a good thing we replaced that sample. Or lost it. I'm not really sure what happened to it, long trip, very fatiguing, are you sure what happened to it?" She smiled. "No ma'am. No earthly idea. That is probably where all that Mars dust came from in the back of my ride," Watney replied. There was no lost sample of course and everyone knew it, but Rick had sacrificed greatly to relieve them. Missy and Mark were not going to let him go home without the best dirt in his collection. NASA and the various other space agencies in the world, especially the Japanese and Russian ones, had done numerous studies on the effects of long-term restrictions in both personal space and stimuli, as well as the duration of mission. Houston had continuously monitored the mental health of both crews as a result of these and a slew of their own studies, looking for both the effects caused by the claustrophobic conditions of Orion 3 as well as Hermes, and the routine of seeing the same black space every day and same people. Originally the Oz-3 crew was put together with the guidance of Irene Shields and her team to ensure long-term compatibility between the crew under the conditions they would face, and some thought, rushed as it was, went into the makeup of Vic-I. What NASA didn't have time for was what might happen when the crews came together, plus the X factor of Lewis and Watney's long-term isolation both at the Oz-3 hab and worse, on what was now being called the Odyssey path they had taken cooped up in the rover, now called Odyssey I, on the way to Oz-4, which had of course been renamed KK. The crew still called the rover Watney's Ride. No one would go along with calling it his pimp wagon. Irene tried to monitor the situation as well as she could, but her study subjects were not cooperative. None wanted to talk about what they were feeling beyond the very basics: anxious to get home, I miss my family and friends, want a cheeseburger, and my leg hurts. From what she could glean from other methods, the crew was basically in good shape mentally, but there were concerns. Alex, perhaps the most isolated in many ways, had thrown himself into his work of the chemical analysis of the soil and air samples. Dana and Chris assisted the other scientists as well as Irene, and had Watney for their own project of how well can we regrow broken bones in space while it sucks the calcium from their subject and themselves. As near as she could tell, Beth, Mindy, Mark had likewise thrown themselves into work, and she believed without proof that Mark and Beth had made themselves busy throwing themselves into each other. On Earth, Beth had promised nothing would happen between them on the mission, but Irene felt it was unrealistic that the conversation they were to have when they returned had really waited. Both seemed quite happy, and other than Mark's injury were the most content of the crew, along with Missy and Mindy for some reason. That left the two pilots, Rick and Anna, who were the least cooperative with Irene's inquiries, which led Irene to have Dana and Chris interview them individually. Chris, as chief medical officer, reported that both were well, anxious to get home to their families, throwing themselves into their work and looking forward to getting feet dry and having a cheeseburger. In actuality, Dana's response had been tell that bitch to fuck herself, and Rick's was of a similar vein, only with even more vulgar and inventive profanity. Ironically, both the Russian and Japanese studies had shown that an increase in the use of profanity was a sign of what was generally known now as capsule isolation syndrome and was a positive way to vent. In Chris and Anna's opinion, NASA Psych was full of a bunch of nannies that, seeing nothing wrong, decided to start poking their crew's working dynamic with sharp sticks to see what would happen. One of the ways NASA had fought this over the years was to have the Capcom, or capsule communicator, to be a fellow astronaut who could appreciate what the crew was going through. The only problem with that was there were no others who had been through what the crew had been through. Missy remained professional, but whenever Rick or Mindy had the com and an RZ or 2 astronaut was acting Capcom, they seemed to talk to the Earthbound astronaut as if they were at best a talented amateur or at worst a small child. This mild friction between Houston and RZ-3 came to a head when the Life Sciences Division requested Mark rerun some experiments testing for sugar levels in corn samples. There would be plenty of corn for the folks in Houston to test themselves, and as he had moved on to X-ray topography of the actual sugar crystals, so Mark felt it was not necessary, but on reply they insisted, and implied they felt he may have erred. This got a curt response that he was currently the universe's leading expert on colonizing other planets and interplanetary botany, and they could fuck themselves before he wasted research time running the tests again. Life Sciences had Mission Control intervene, and while Mitch also thought it was stupid as there was plenty of other work for Mark to do, he passed the request to Lewis as commander and Mindy as XO. Each sent a response, Lewis generally supporting Mark, who she referred to as NASA's leading interplanetary botanist, while Mindy asked if they were done fucking themselves. Irene took this group unity as a great positive for their overall dynamic. Mitch just replied Roger that Hermes. Annie Montrose was elated to release a PG-13 version of The Exchange as she continued to build her crew into a media godsend for NASA. The crew continued to correspond and do reports with KK, who continued to delight and amuse them as she grew into a very professional anchor for their reports. Mindy, Missy, Dana and Anna counseled her on life matters privately, urging her to stay focused on her education and each lobbying her to their alma maters, and that at her age boys were a distraction, although a nice one, and to be careful with who she chose to socialize with and date. KK had little interest in any of the boys she knew, so that had not become an issue. Alex, Chris, Rick and especially Mark became the big brothers she never had and privately promised operatic levels of intimidation to any boy foolish enough to hurt her. The on-screen chemistry between them was fun to watch, and their ratings continuously improved, especially as the delay time between the ship and Earth became less and less. As the Hermes was approximately a minute transmission time from Houston, interest in the mission began to rise again and several things happened. Alex and Mark got approval to publish papers on their initial results, and Mark got approval to submit a dissertation for a doctorate in mechanical engineering with a focus on environmental. He had worked it up while still on Mars but had not applied for permission to publish until he talked to Alex and found out he was doing the same. Another project Mark was working on was likewise approved, but the final output would still need to be run through NASA censors. Mark told the crew about it at the next daily staffing. A book? No, 3 books, maybe 4, and you guys are going to be credited, so, I'm looking for a huge advance. The first 2 parts are written, I did most of them at KK, but I need your help with the other. One is about going to Mars and our work there up to the evac, the next is the commander and me getting to KK and all we did there. The last is about your trip to Earth, back to Mars, our recovery, and then back to Earth. If Vicky wants to compile one, Well then there would be 4, but most of us wouldn't get credit on that. How much did you write in? Commander Lewis asked. Oh, I just novelized the dailies, it wasn't difficult, and nothing is in it that isn't already out there. Except for the red smog monster. Rick asked. Well yeah, I had to add something for dramatic effect. We will need to invent a working laser tray bucket before we get home if they want proof of how Commander Lewis saved us that day. Mark laughed. Look, if you don't want me to, I will delete it all now. I just figure, well, I want to buy a bigger place outside town in farm country when I get back, and will there be room there for? Mindy started to ask, then decided against it. Yeah, that's the plan. Tell ya what, read what I have so far. I just sent it to each of your pads, he said as he tapped his screen. How much are you looking at? Alex asked, knowing his family would want him to participate. 6 figures. Closer to 9. Damn Watney, I like this idea. Anna exclaimed. Well, you guys have to put together the Vicky part, but just working off the logs it's pretty easy. Wait. No, just no, Watney, Lewis said as she looked at the document Mark had sent her. What's wrong? Beth asked. As long as it didn't get into their personal lives, she was ambivalent about it. She was already rich. Missy rolled her eyes and laughed. He titled the first book To Mars and Back, A Botanist's Tale. Good Lord, Watney. I guess the second is. The 2 Marvs, needs work, I admit, but the third is really great. The Return of the King, Watney. Really? Well, those are just working titles. I'm proud of the text itself. Please read it and give me feedback. If you want anything cut out, just let me know. That evening he explained his idea to Beth, Mindy and Missy more fully. Yeah, so I want to get a place in the country where we could all be, either in one big house. No, but I might live next door, Missy interrupted while Beth and Mindy just smiled at each other as they were okay with the idea. Yeah, well, I figure by the time I get it built, interest in us, the mission will die down and we can go on with our lives. Whatever that is, I want it to be with you all. I mean, I'm not sure what that means or how it would work, but like I said before, I'm not dropping any of you. You all mean everything to me. The Martians. Chapter 29. 2 months out, the bidding wars started. NASA had been licensing the crew's image for posters, t-shirts and such, and the crew got a slice of that, but once they landed, they would be hot properties in the marketing world. Watney, through a recommended agent, was able to get the sort of advance he wanted on books, and even more was being offered for the movie rights for a book that no one on Earth had read yet. Then there were speaking engagements. NASA had a bunch the crew were obligated to do, but it seemed like every email dump brought a new round of universities, corporations and think tanks wanting them to speak. Each of these were independent of NASA, and that made them quite profitable. Although others made more money, the crew's favorite was the maker of Barbie, as a result of the Katie Rockpiles and backstory that Doris had released, approached Mark about doing a Mark Watney Ken collectible. He refused unless the rest of the crew, including KK, had dolls as Barbie or Ken as well. Mattel agreed, with the further stipulation that the first 1,000 would be numbered collectibles, which would have a higher cost, and thus a higher royalty to the crew, and the remainder be general issue a few months after the primary release. Mark asked that his share be given to St. Jude's. The rest of the crew made this stipulation as well, and on their own the company agreed that number 1 in each would be auctioned as a group to support the charity. Mark asked that a number 0 series be given to Doris, and the company was happy to do this as well. KK thought it was weird as she never liked dolls for the most part, but thought it might be cool given that a number of people she knew from school had grown up playing with them, and those being the socially popular kids she avoided, decided that this might just be the best thing ever. After she became something of a celebrity, the popular kids had tried to befriend her, but KK remembered how they treated her when she was just another goth nobody, so she ignored them. Her closest friends were all in space, and she would be flying out to Florida to meet them soon. Watney figured Rick, Alex and Chris would be difficult to convince, but Chris was okay with it given that it would give needed attention to childhood cancer, while both Rick and Alex had young daughters who would just love it. Missy was in the end the last holdout, but once her crew was all in, she was too. Missy just felt like it may make her appear less serious and might hurt her marketable image. Her first comment on seeing the prototype, which was a doll in a make-believe Eva suit that had no helmet, was to the point. My boobs aren't that big. No one's boobs are that big, Commander. Can you imagine how those would float around in reduced gravity? Shut up, Watney. The days became more hectic every week as the crew was slammed with email, actual research work, and prepping to arrive. Then, they were almost home. Another 2 weeks and they would land by shuttle at KSC. Hermes had rotated and began retrofiring to slow down so it would be able to dock at Discovery Station /SpaceX, and the rotational gravity had been increased, much to Watney's displeasure. He was mobile now and walking without assistance in a boot devised and created by the doctors, with the assistance of the Houston Med Sciences team, but it still hurt to put additional weight on it, and at 1.3 gravity the weight increase was significant. It would be worth it to avoid a wheelchair ride on arrival. No one had done that since John Glenn, and Mark didn't want to be the one that broke the streak. This was a subject of debate among the physicians on the ground, but both doctors on Hermes were satisfied Mark could walk the rope line into the facility from the van that would bring them from the landing strip. The debate went back and forth for several days until it was decided a chair would be discreetly nearby, but Mark could walk if he wanted to. The deciding factor was Mark's input of "fuck you guys" whenever Houston advised him to use the wheelchair, and Houston deciding it wasn't worth sedating him in view of the whole world watching. It was agreed Chris, Dana and Alex would be on the lookout to assist him if necessary, though the crew had seen him mobile for a month and none thought he would need it. Plans for their homecoming increased as the ship drew nearer to Earth and included a whirlwind tour around the country, a few supporting countries, and every morning news and talk show on any network with more than a handful of viewers. Of course, all would visit media from their hometowns, and as promised they would tour both KSC and Orlando with KK and her family. This visit actually excited some of the crew, as all had been there at one time or another as children, only this time would feature them in a parade down Main Street, USA that would end up at the Star Wars section of Tomorrowland. "So Mark, I was wondering," Mindy asked as they both ended their work shifts and stretched out in his bunk. "Wondering what?" he softly asked. Of the 3 women he was involved with, each had their own personality. Missy was passionate in bed and at life in general, while Beth was very loving and romantic. Mindy was experimental and generally the wildest, and sometimes the weirdest. "What do you know about Gemini 4? Huh? That was the first spacewalk one, wasn't it?" James McDivitt earned. "And Ed White. Very good. You read your NASA history text in training. You're so smart," she giggled. "Well, yeah, I've been to college and shit." "Why the interest in Gemini 2? "It was the first American spacewalk. No one really knew what would happen, so it was scheduled for 10 minutes. McDivitt exited the capsule, and was out for almost 25 minutes, but I remember, Houston was begging him to come back in and he kept taking pictures of everything." "Right, the combination of weightlessness, floating, and the high oxygen content of his suit gave him euphoria, so since then we've had more nitrogen and helium in the mix. It's like the opposite of what divers get because of the unrestricted blood flow to the brain and the O2. When they finally got him to come in, he said it was the saddest moment of his life." "So? Well, Beth and Missy are at the con, everyone else is asleep for red shift, the core shaft has no gravity and is high O2, and I have a sleeping bag from Orion, so if 2 people were trying to achieve ultimate euphoria, purely as a scientific experiment, you understand, they wouldn't drift away from each other," she smirked. "Well, if it's for science." Watney smiled. No scientists other than Mark and Mindy would ever learn that they had worked long and hard to confirm the hypothesis, but several hours later Anna would be coming up to the green room and woke the couple with a shout of Jesus. "Watney, put some damn clothes on." This had the effect of waking most of the ship as both Mark and Mindy struggled to find their clothes, barely saving further embarrassment as the groggy crew came to see what the hubbub was about. It's not easy getting dressed in zero gravity when one leg is in a walking cast, but the couple managed to do it in record time as Anna smirked. As the crew worked their way to the core, from both the living pods as well as the bridge, the couple was saved by a happy accident. "Oh good, you're all awake. Come forward to the comm observation port, there's something you need to see." Science fiction movies got one thing wrong, always. Ships near the Earth are always shown seeing a gigantic array of stars. It is not like that at all usually. On Earth, you generally see stars only at night or during an eclipse. During normal daylight hours, the sun's brightness overpowers the more distant and hence weaker light from the stars, so really there is no night in space, at least not in the Mars range of the sun. The crew had all seen and been amazed by the brilliance of the Martian night when its own shadow blocked the sun and the sky became illuminated with an umbrella of stars, but traveling in the Hermes, towards the sun, the sky was just black, and rather boring. Until a few minutes before, when the moon crossed their path for a few minutes and the sky lit up. Looking through the viewport, the view was breathtaking. Each stared at the vastness of space with a clarity of stars they had not seen since their last night on Mars, and that most would not see again. "How long will it last?" someone asked. "About 35 minutes, then we will be out of the shadow of the moon," Beth replied. "It's really just a coincidence of the calendar that we are seeing it at all. Eclipses don't last that long. We are further away. Bigger shadow." When it was over, Mark whispered, "This may be the saddest moment of my life." Within days the crew entered the final phase of their journey. Although the demand for interviews was up, usually only 1 or 2 participated at a time as gear was being stowed and samples in labs returned to storage for their trip home. Missy, Mindy and Rick also demanded a thorough scrub down of the ship, as they didn't want Ars-3/Vic to have the reputation that Ars-I did for leaving the ship slovenly for the refurb crew. Because of the load, 2 shuttles would be used, one for crew and about a quarter of the material they brought back, the other just for samples. As a cost savings measure, it was suggested that the Orion 3 be loaded up, refueled and landed, however this was nixed due to safety concerns. The samples were a cross-section of all on both shuttles, so if one crashed, the other would bring material home. In the end, both landed just fine. The Orion 3 would be refueled and would return by remote operation, supposedly so NASA could study it for the construction of a new generation of MDV/MAVs based upon it, but really it was so it would have a well-earned retirement at the National Air and Space Museum. NASA decided to forego the usual period of isolation as being pointless. However, the crew would stay in seclusion, and have all the standard booster vaccinations and immunity boosters to ward off everyday illness that could be fatal with their suppressed immune systems. After the welcome home celebration, which the crew was still calling Princess KK's coronation ball, they would be public again, but first would get the regular, although abbreviated, routine in the astronaut apartments for a few days just to get readjusted to gravity and checked out by the medical and psych staff. During this time they would be surrounded by family and friends, and making multiple media appearances by remote. After that, Orlando with KK and her family, all filmed, then slung around the world in PR appearances. It would go on for several weeks, and although astronauts didn't have a long shelf life media-wise, this crew was different. Once they finished the NASA appearances, they would do a book tour in support of their newly published works and meet with Hollywood types bidding to make a movie, or movies, out of it. What the crew really wanted to do was get a beer and a cheeseburger, then lay on a beach roasting somewhere. At lunch the day before docking, which was the first meal the entire crew had at the same time due to work schedules for several weeks, a discussion came up of who they wanted to play them in the film. Most had some idea, none of which really looked or acted like them, and finally Mark was prodded as to who he wanted. "I don't really care, we all know it's going to suck. They won't get anything right," he grinned. "Nope, no copping out, Mark, we all told you have to. Not letting you get by without an answer," Missy laughed. "No, I really don't care, as long as they are young, good looking, you know. Oh, and not the guy that played me in Watney's Space Harem." The room fell silent. Finally, Rick asked, "You know about that?" "Yeah, somebody from Vic 1 had it loaded on the entertainment files." Everyone looked around at each other, when Anna finally raised her hand. "Guilty. It came out right after our crew was announced and we started training. My roommate from the academy sent it to me. She thought it would be funny. I thought it would be funny to surprise Mark one movie night, just as a joke, but, well, never got around to it." "When did you watch it, Mark? Why did you watch it, Mark?" Dana asked. "Oh, like the second or third time I had the day watch. You guys were Eva, so I searched for my entertainment files. I just labeled them Watney and you'll never guess what popped up as the first entry on that search. Commander, the woman that plays your part is nothing like you at all." "Shut up, Watney." Missy laughed. "Really, Mark? You're comparing us to porn actors?" "Oh no, Mindy, there's no comparison." "Well, I would hope not. They are relatively quiet." Okay. That's enough. Who's looking forward to the coronation ball? Anna asked with a giggle. Think they will do a sequel? Mark asked almost under his breath. Part 2 came out just as we left. Rick cackled. So, Mark, tell us about this Italian place that is catering. Any good? Beth asked. I don't know, Marissa won't let me watch it. Rick giggled. I was asking Mark about the Italian place. I know. Rick grinned. One thing I remember about it. Mark started to say before Missy interrupted. That's enough, Mark. We don't need to hear your sordid details. She blushed. Oh, no, I wasn't talking about the movie per se, it's just, you know how when you pull up video, audio or book files on that system, it tells you when you last viewed it. Mark. Anna and Mindy both said. What did it say? Alex asked, with a smile that could make a cat disappear. It was last viewed the Tuesday before the commander and I arrived. That was movie night back then, wasn't it? So. Whatney? I swear, Mindy exclaimed, her blush along with Anna and Donna's revealing he told the truth. Well. Was the woman that played the commander at least attractive? Missy finally asked. Well, she was very talented, I can see why she got the job, but no, you are far more attractive. Donna said diplomatically. I thought she overacted in places and really was a poor commander overall. That ship would have been soaked in baby oil in a real weightless environment, Beth added. Some people just aren't made for command. They never get the science right. Wait, when did you see it? Watney asked. Oh, Beth blushed. Well, we were on Earth a couple months. I'm not going to answer that. Hey, does anyone know what day it is? You mentioning Tuesday movie night reminded me of that. I don't know what day it is. It's October 3rd, and Missy said. No, the day of the week. The crew all looked at each other and realized none of them had any idea. They had been running on sol dates and mission dates so long, none of them knew the day of the week. No one would have known the month or date had it not been on all the computer screens, and for the most part, no one cared about that either. After a pregnant pause, Alex spoke for all of them. Weird. The Martians. Chapter 30. The first 3 months of the Hermes return trajectory had flown by as the crew, in particular Mark, Alex and Missy, threw themselves into research with the rest of the crew assisting. The last month was like being stuck in an elevator on the way back from a dentist with the Muzak track stuck on a loop of theme from a summer place. It was tedious. For weeks the crew had busied itself as it slowly watched the distance from Hermes to Earth shrink at an excruciatingly slow pace. As the engines of the Hermes were pointed toward Earth in order to slow it for hookup, the first real view of Earth was the day before arrival, and all of the crew was crowded forward in the com for hours in order to view in wonder their home. With approximately 5 hours to dock, Lewis called the crew forward for an unscheduled meeting. As he had been in quarters reading a book, Mark was the last to arrive, just a moment after Donna and Chris. Thanks for coming, guys. It goes without saying that this is the finest crew any NASA commander has ever had, and I want to thank you. Your dedication and professionalism is unparalleled in the history of exploration, but that's not why we're here. What's up, Commander? What did Mark do this time? Rick grinned. Lewis waited for everyone, including herself, to stop chuckling. Well, so far, he hasn't missed the transfer to SpaceX, but I guess we should put a team on making sure he doesn't. She grinned, but this time, it's not Mark. It's you, Rick, oh, and our other pilot Anna. I just received word from Houston. Our Force launch window is 3 years, and the final training roster is up. You're listed as primary pilot and alternate command if Johnson has to bail, and I'm getting word that Johnson may bail. Okay, it's not public knowledge and won't be, but Johnson is going to bail. Health issue, not enough to kill him, but enough to ground. Congratulations, Rick, it appears you're going to command Ars 4. You'll be great. Are you stupid? Why the fuck would you willingly do that? Fuck? Mark asked, shocked that his friend would volunteer to go back. Flying is what I do. I put in for it last time we were on Earth. Marissa is going to kill you, Alex said. No, she understands. Of course this time we will make sure we don't make 2 trips. But then I retire. I will have gone to Mars more than anyone and logged more peak time than anyone in history. I think that will be enough. Congratulations Rick, I think. Oh, and it won't be announced for a few weeks, but you're a full bird now. Probably make the jump to general by the time you get back again, so congrats on that too. Missy smiled. That's really great Rick, you deserve it. Anna smiled. As everyone else jumped in, Missy held her hand up for silence. One more thing, Lieutenant Colonel Anna Washburn is listed as primary command for RSV. That is a year after Rick's return and will be a 6-month mission on surface. Congratulations to both of you, I can think of no better officers to lead those crews. If you are like I was a few years ago, you're wondering if you are up for the enormity of the task. Everyone here knows you both are. Good luck and Godspeed. Woohoo! Anna exclaimed as everyone congratulated her as well, and also declared her crazy for wanting to return. Wait, Lieutenant Colonel, she asked. Yep, your promotion was also in the email. Enjoy it. If you're anything like Martinez, you won't hold it long before your next jump. The docking at Discovery was almost anticlimactic. Rick, with Alex guiding him and Chris calling out distances from the docking bay, brought the ship in with the skill he had used to pilot her for nearly 3 years. Sighs were exhaled and every set of shoulders on board slumped forward for a few moments with the realization that they were almost home, almost done with Hermes, and almost done with space. The relief and refurb crew was greeted and the crew began medical checks upon the arrival of the 2 shuttles sent for them and their research materials. The refurb and Discovery crews were both friendly but no one felt like talking much, although group pics and photos of individuals were taken so that all would have keep sake from the Hermes arrival. None of the Hermes or Vic-1 crews expected to keep any of their copies, other than the ones shot with their fellow crew members. A day at Discovery getting further inoculations and boosters while refurb stowed the research, and they were off. After a couple hours of weightless flight on the shuttle, then 30 minutes or so of abject terror during reentry, and the crew was feet dry at KSC. On the return flight Mark would sit between Mindy and Beth, each of them squeezing his hands during the horror that was reentry. His eyes were closed and he gripped their hands for comfort as well. Re-entry was the worst and most dangerous part of the journey, as well as the most terrifying. There had been some discussion on what order the crew members would depart the shuttle as they would be in view of the telephotos of the press corps and public, as well as the NASA photogs at the foot of the stairs, with Annie and the PR department wanting one order and normal procedure calling for another. In the end it was decided that Hermes crew, having departed Earth last, would be nearly the last off the ship, with Vic-1 going first. The last 2 off would be Lewis and Watney. This meant for Annie Montrose that one of her celebrities, Mindy, would be in the first group off, another, Beth, would be in the second group, while the 2 astronauts that most fascinated the public would be last. Annie liked this plan as it would keep the crowd focused on each as they departed. As the crew members stepped down the metal stairs each name was announced over the loudspeakers at the viewing area, although over the idling engines of their escort craft the crew did not hear it, and each name drew cheers that got progressively louder. Finally, at the door, with his crew and other med staff at the bottom of the stairs in case his leg gave out and he fell, Mark looked to Missy and though he wanted to get out of the ship and breathe real air more than anything, offered her the doorway. I've been on Mars longer, you go first Commander. Leave in order of rank, I go last. Associate Commander Lewis grinned. Together? Mark asked as he extended a hand towards her while the flight crew just stared wishing they would get off the ship. They hated re-entry as well. Together. As it should be Lewis replied, taking Mark's offered hand and with him stepping through the portal to the top of the stairs. They could see the crowd and waved with their spare hands, then held their joined ones aloft in unity. They couldn't hear it of course, but could see the crowd waving back and cheering. The air smelled of JP-1 exhaust from the escort planes and from the shuttle's landing retros, and nothing like the sterile atmosphere they had lived in for so long. Mark closed his eyes and relished the polluted air, breathing deep, then opened his eyes to see Lewis doing the same. A nod between them said let's get out of here and they went down the steps, Mark gingerly walking on his leg but generally doing okay. Any pain he felt was overcome by the elation of finally finishing their mission. A van drove the crew and their handlers to the reception area where they exited in the reverse of the order they had left the shuttle, and walked the last 50 yards or so to the primary reception hall that held more medical staff, a slew of officials, and their families. On this walk they could clearly see and hear the crowd behind the yellow caution line cheering and holding up signs welcoming them back. This crowd was mostly NASA employees, a few lucky tourists, and lesser VIPs. The crew smiled and waved back. The smiles had nothing to do with the crowd, the crew was just happy to be home. Still, they smiled and waved and looked futilely for a recognizable face in the crowd while they walked in the sweltering Florida heat until they were in the shadow of the large garage-type doorway of the reception building. Here, air conditioning and relative darkness hit them, and they were, for the most part, blind while their eyes slowly adjusted. In addition, because of all the cheers they may as well have been deaf. Once they were able to see clearly, 2 lines of red velvet rope held back people they did know, or at least recognize. Mostly higher politicos, Congress and Senate members, a smattering of camera crews, reporters and the ilk, NASA division chiefs, CEOs of critical vendor corporations, and at the far end, their families and friends. All the crew focused on their loved ones naturally and smiled or politely waved, at best, at the questions and congratulations shouted at them. Annie Montrose and Venkat Kapoor approached with a smile and said on behalf of NASA, "Welcome home crew. If you'll come this way, we have an area set up so you can see your families and catch up a bit, then we will do a press conference in an hour or." Dr. Watney. Mark ignored Annie after her first words as he spotted at the edge of the crowd, just behind the red barrier, a diminutive Polynesian girl grinning from ear to ear clapping and shouting, along with 2 older persons that appeared to be her parents. He had always figured her to be taller for some reason. As soon as he recognized her, he broke from the crew and limped as quickly as he could towards her. The girl smiled and started to slip out to meet him, only to be stopped by an Air Force security officer assigned to the rope line. Not knowing quite what to do, the girl pleaded with her eyes to Mark, and the crew that was now following him. She was rescued by Rick and Anna, both wearing rank insignia significantly higher than the second lieutenant blocking her way, who in no uncertain terms made it clear that the young girl was crew and should be allowed in. The young officer knew neither was in his chain of command, and likewise knew that both would make the jump to general rank long before he exited the service and were thus people he should not piss off. Just as Rick was ready to tear into the young officer, who was only following orders, the guard received a message on his earpiece, turned to the trio behind the rope line, and told them they could come through. The girl ran into Mark's, and then the rest of the crew's, waiting arms. Mark clutched her as hard as he could as tears filled both their eyes. A quick-acting reporter for the Jacksonville newspaper snapped away and was as a result placed in the running for a Pulitzer that year, only to lose out to pictures of refugees from the war in South America. Still, it was a memorable shot that got the photojournalist the cover of National Geographic in addition to worldwide publication. The cover photo was captioned simply "Welcome Home" and filled the front page of the Jacksonville paper in the morning. "Hi, we haven't really met, but I'm Mark. Hey, I'm KK. It's good to meet you in person finally. You're taller in real life. Thanks, Thanks for talking me through the launch and keeping us company on Mars. I mean it, you're a lifesaver." "It was nothing, glad to help." KK smiled. Mark introduced KK to the crew, and all wanted to squeeze the stuffing out of her. Finally, Annie tried to gather the crew up and have KK come back at the appointed time, only to have Lewis intervene. "KK, you're with us," Missy said over the noise of the crowd as she and Mark each took a hand and led her and her parents away and into the family reception room. It was quieter there and all were embraced by their families and the celebrations began. KK and her parents sat with Mark and his, while everyone else reunited with their own. Catherine's mother Doris flew in with Mark's parents at his mother's insistence and all told her how moved they were at her daughter's life and story. Over the next hour everyone was introduced to the crew's mascot and protege, which KK thought was weird, but she was so very happy to finally see her friends in real life and not just on video. Bob was not there by design. Missy's parents had both traveled from Missoula to see their daughter and brought a cousin she had grown up with. "Hey Meredith, thanks for coming, were you able to get it?" "Yeah, the jeweler thought it was odd to leave a hole in it. You have a stone to place there?" "Yeah, if I measured it right, and I'm pretty sure I did. It's for our princess over there, no one else knows about it." "Your crew doesn't know?" "Nope. Well, they know some, but this is a bit shady, so I left them out of it." Missy smiled as she hugged her cousin and took a small bag from her. "A bit shady?" her cousin asked with a smirk. Okay, a lot shady. Totally sketchy in fact. If anyone asks, there was a big ass green rock on it when you gave it to me, K. Not a problem. I remember that big ass green rock well. Looked like jade, I think. She smiled. Glassier than jade, and the color of lime jello. Missy grinned. Right, jade-colored glass, that looked like lime jello. Exactly. I remember it well. The reunions were all too brief as a day full of events was just beginning. Next were showers. Most had not had a long shower since leaving Earth, and none at all in a few days as the ship's rotation was ceased for docking. The need to feel clean became overpowering the longer the astronauts met with their families and realized the difference in what they felt was clean and what the rest of the world did. What's that? Dana asked as she saw Missy messing with something in the dressing room following bath time. Oh, a side project. I figured since tonight is the coronation ball our princess needed a proper crown. Missy replied, showing her work to the other women, all being impressed. My cousin did pageants as a kid, so I measured one of the olivines after I polished and shaped it. Flight research log says half of it was consumed by testing. No need for anyone to mention that. Anyway, Meredith got one of her jewelers from those days to make this up with a mounting for it, and it snapped right in. It was a tiara covered with crystals, except for a large, lime green, mostly clear, stone at the top in the center. On Earth a similar olivine that was cut and faceted would be worth maybe $100. Given the provenance of this one, even though it was just cut to shape and polished, it was probably worth millions. Of course, no one would ever officially know where this one had come from. The press conference was dull and mercifully short. It was for the general media for the most part, so there were not a lot of technical questions asked as there normally would be, and as the reporters asking were not well versed in the mission, it became more of a questioning about human interest story angles. The crew would have been much happier addressing scientific inquiries from academic journals, and would in a few days, but this day was all about how do you feel and what was it like. Not a single question about Alex's groundbreaking discoveries regarding non-ferrous minerals in the surface material, or Mark's work on removing perchlorates from the soil so as to make it possible to grow plants, but a whole bunch of what did it feel like to be stranded on Mars, and did you ever lose hope? These were repeatedly answered with I didn't like it and no, not with this crew, there was no need to lose hope. Are you looking forward to meeting the president tonight? We're meeting the president tonight. Annie answered that the crew had not been told that the president was flying in to attend their celebration. This president was well liked by the crew as she seemed to be able to both read and write, as well as use actual grammar to make complete sentences, so they were okay with it but didn't really care. As a result, they all sort of looked back and forth waiting for each other to respond, as if they were deer stuck in the headlights of an oncoming car. Finally, Mark stepped up to the plate and pissed NASA off. Well, it is good and proper for the leaders of the various Earthican governments to be present to witness and celebrate the coronation of Princess KK of Mars. Speaking for the princess, I know she looks forward to establishing peaceful relations between the worlds. I haven't seen the schedule yet, but hopefully tomorrow we can tour Kennedy Space Center with the princess, and of course Madam President is welcome to join us. Teddy rolled his eyes in exasperation, but Annie was soon on the phone to the White House press secretary to give them a heads up. Plans and schedules were rearranged, and the president joined the crew and KK for at least part of their visit to KSC. Following the press conference, the crew went through their first round of psych evaluations. Irene would have preferred to do that before the conference, but there was not time. The crew had held so many conferences from space that there was little fear of any psych issues arising during it. The crew all lied like dogs during their evaluations, which was anticipated. The seasoned pros of Irene's team knew they were lying, expected it, and knew that what they were lying about and how they were doing so was as telling as any actual truth was. All were found, as expected, to be D-deprived, and further vitamin shots were prescribed as a result. All to some degree or another had separation anxiety and isolation disorders, and this was expected as well. Missy and Mark were practically agoraphobic, while the rest just didn't really like the crowds and were uncomfortable and slow to adjust to the open spaces now available to them. Disorientation at the change in surroundings was found as well, and this too was across the entire crew. In the end, no great unsolvable psych issues were found, and none outside what was perceived to be the normal spectrum given their experiences. That there was no one to compare their reactions to meant this was a very soft conclusion, so all would be monitored and have sessions with Irene and her team in the coming weeks. Medically, with the exception of Mark's leg, all were physically fine. A bit underweight, but that was anticipated given that their caloric intake fell as their revulsion to space food rose. It was decided that Mark's leg had healed more than anticipated given the crew staff's care, but that on Earth he would have been walking fine by now. This too would be monitored, but no problems were foreseen. Before dinner, or the coronation as the crew called it, there was a reception with the Grand High Muckety Mucks of Washington, NASA and a few from the rest of the world, including China, who had given up a heavy launch to assist with refurb and resupply. Photos were taken with the crew for each I Love Me walls, and the crew demanded KK be in many of them, especially the president and her senators from Hawaii. The crew wore the standard NASA astronaut blue jumpsuits, while KK wore the skirt, blouse and blazer she wore when anchoring the crew's reports. Both the crew and KK's attire bore the patches of both Rs-3 and Victoria I. At dinner that night, as promised catered in part by Mark's two favorite Chicago pizzerias, the president spoke, because that's what presidents do, and when she got to the usual line about touching the face of God the crowd got weepy, because that's what crowds of politicians on camera do, all the while Mark and KK, along with the crew, stuffed their faces with the best pizza any of them could remember having, because that's what teen girls and returning astronauts do. The ambassador from Germany spoke as well as the director of the SR and Teddy on behalf of NASA. Finally, the crew got to the microphone, with Missy speaking on behalf of all. She read a speech off a teleprompter that she had prepared with the assistance of Annie's team as the Hermes neared Earth, and that all the media already had copies of. She only deviated from it to again thank NASA, and especially the Hermes and Victoria I crews on behalf of her and Mark. She also took the time to especially thank Rick and Mindy for their leadership, dedication and professionalism in guiding the respective ships on their journey, and all of their families for their sacrifice. Each crew member also got a few words of gratitude as Missy wanted to leave no one out, even though all had been thanked repeatedly for the last year and a half and didn't need to hear it again. Missy just wanted to say it all publicly. Lewis then turned to Mark and added, "I would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleague and partner on this trip. Mark, you kept us alive. I can never repay you any more than I could repay Rick, Alex, Beth, Chris, Mindy, Dana and Anna. You are the spirit of discovery, and without your indefatigable efforts, we would both still be at Rs-3 base, and would never leave. You have my never-ending gratitude, admiration, and love." With that, even Mark's eyes teared up. Enough so that he put down his fork and stopped eating long enough to accept the hug that Lewis walked across the stage to give him. That was the other photo that ran in the press the next day. Missy got back on script and with Mark and Mindy introduced KK, who was already well known, and went through a spiel of naming her Princess Kalani KK Akina, Princess of Mars, Duchess of Schiaparelli, Defender of the Faith, and Martian Ambassador to Earth. During this Missy handed Mark the tiara her cousin had provided, and Mark placed it on her head. All of the crew and most of the crowd were giggling at this, but Teddy woke the next day to calls from several of the world's space agencies, each asking in their own way what the fuck. During the ceremony the president was seen laughing like she was at the White House press dinner and endorsed KK's new rank with pleasure. The next morning, she toured the main visitors area at KSC with the crew for a half hour or so, did a brief presser with them and KK, then flew back to DC. The crew took KK and her parents all over the facility as promised, with a team of docents guiding them as none of the crew knew their way around there, and after a couple days rest, timed so that Orlando would coincide with the weekend crowds, did Disney with a parade through Main Street, USA. The crew and their families were spread out over several horse-drawn carriages, the last carrying just Lewis, Watney and a crown wearing KK. While there, KK shared autographs with all the princesses, and the crew's arms nearly fell off from all they signed. Another presser was held at the Star Wars section of Tomorrowland revealing Barbie Mars collection, with the zero-numbered set presented to Doris McCallister, with the number 1 set announced to be auctioned for St. Jude's. It was also announced that the crew and KK were giving their royalties on the limited edition to the same cause, buying tremendous PR for NASA. The next few days KK saw the rest of Orlando with her parents, the crew recovered, rested and was interviewed by every news service in the world. A welcome home show was filmed with KK in which the crew showed her through the research that had been conducted so far, as well as letting her handle a bunch of samples from Mars, showing the differences between the soil texture and composition between Rs3 and KK, and a long Odyssey path. The vast majority of NASA employees would never actually touch the sample containers, so that was a big deal to the high schooler. At the end of the filming, after the cameras were off and everyone mingled, Missy approached KK with Mark. "Hey, can we borrow you for a second?" Sure, she smiled. Missy and Mark led her to a back corner of the storage area and Missy drew one small sample container from the racks they were stored in by date, location and number. "We know you probably don't want to be charged with keeping secrets, but you have to promise to never tell about this, okay?" Okay, she replied, confused. "Does this look familiar?" It's pretty," KK said of the green, unpolished, uncut olivine. "Ever seen a green rock like that before?" Mark asked. "It kinda looks like, KK stammered as her eyes bulged. "We took a vote and wanted you to know. You really are our princess, you're going to go far in life." "Oh, but you can't tell anyone as we're breaking a dozen rules and probably a couple federal laws." "Got it. Oh, and you might want to get your folks to get a safe deposit box for your crown." "Got it. Thanks. And thanks for letting me, hang out with you guys." "Girl, you earned that," Missy said as she wrapped her arms around her. "Now, you have to do me a favor. I know everyone has been trying to sell you on their colleges, but don't go to Navy, you won't fit in there. You would do great but you wouldn't enjoy it. You are too much of a free spirit for the program, nothing wrong with that, but you're more like Mark or Mindy than Rick or me. And don't go to Northwestern either," Mark said with a grin, "it's too cold and you would freeze to death." "But you can't tell anyone I told you not to go, there are bets about where you will choose and well, I hope to lose that one. Great school but well, you aren't made for Chicago in the winter." A final dinner in Florida and the Aquinas flew home with more hugs and more thanks. Then the crew set off on a tour of the nation and world doing promotional work for NASA, then a book tour to promote their story. That would be their work for the next several months, even though all wanted to get back to Houston and get back to their real jobs. The crew would next see their protege in person would be a year and a half later. Mark got curious one day and contacted Astrodynamics to find out what Earth Day the Martian KK Day would fall upon. Mars year is 1.88 of an Earth year, and its day right at a half-hour longer, so it took some ciphering. It worked out to be late May, and checking both his friend's schedule and the school schedule in Hawaii concocted a scheme that worked out well. KK had worked hard and would be valedictorian. Her online tutors were all proud of this accomplishment and wanted to celebrate it somehow, so when Mark made the calls, all agreed. The school was contacted, and the principal was happy to help and keep a secret. A request was made to Teddy, and while he wouldn't agree to the request, he did agree to look the other way. So it was that KK, none the wiser, arrived at her high school gym with her parents, put her cap and gown on over her usual black tee and board shorts, with heels that she hated. She was so excited she didn't notice the 2 little spots of Velcro her mother had glued to her gown. Annie Montrose had personally helped her write her speech via email and video conference, and by the program that was printed she was to deliver it just before the convocation by the principal and special guests. KK never saw the order of convocation program that was handed out to everyone when they arrived, so she didn't even know there were special guests. KK had sent invitations to the crew and some of the NASA staff and knew it would be too long of a trip for them to make just for the occasion, but was a still little disappointed that the people she considered to be her best friends were not there on what had now become a big night for her. She understood though and planned to email them a video that was being shot by the school as each had requested it. She was just nervous enough to not notice a few extra chairs on the stage, but by this time, KK was an experienced speaker and delivered her speech with confidence and poise. Until the last 2 sentences. As she spoke, and all of her fellow students ignored her, as that's what graduating students do when one of their own has to speak and they have to listen, a murmur went up in the crowd. KK looked at the crowd and realized they were all staring past her, just as a voice whispered from over her shoulder. "Is this the Princess KK Day celebration?" KK's eyes got huge as she turned in shock to see the crew standing in NASA blazers behind her, each bearing both the Rs3 and Vic eye patches. The crew had walked quietly onto the stage from the wings and were glad they were able to maintain surprise until the last minute. The audience failed to give it away only because most were as shocked as KK to see them there. "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. What are? Oh my god. Thank you for coming," she shouted as she hugged each with her eyes flooding with tears of joy. "Miss Akina, perhaps you could introduce your friends to your classmates. They have come to our school to assist with the convocation of diplomas today, and we are proud to have them with us," the principal suggested. KK excitedly tore through the crew's names, introducing each and listing their specialty on the mission. Then Missy, on behalf of the crew and NASA, stepped to the mic and spoke briefly about the pride each student should have and that this was only the beginning. They would face many challenges, but this crew was proof that all challenges could be overcome with hard work, determination, and learning. When she was done, she turned back to KK and the principal. "KK, you may not remember it, but when Mark and I first arrived at, KK, or US4 as it was then known, command was transferred to me. However, it was delayed because Mark and I were not in proper uniform. A convocation is, among other things, a passing of the torch from one generation to another. We are happy to assist with this, and we know the future is in good hands, but, at present, you are likewise out of uniform. Dr. Johansson, Dr. Park, would you assist young KK?" Each stepped forward and on the velcro of her gown placed mission patches from US4 and Victoria I. "Thank you doctors, Miss KK, you are now in proper uniform. It may interest you to know those particular patches I cut from one of the jumpsuits I wore while working at the site that now bears your name. Wear them with pride and honor. They have traveled a long way to be here with you. I know you will do them justice," Mark said as KK beamed with pride at the gift. "You have gotten over the shyness you had when we first met, KK, but I know you want to get back to your friends, get your diploma and go celebrate. I ask you bear with us just a moment further. As you know, it is against NASA policy to give away any research samples gathered in space, but there is nothing that says we can't loan them. We ask that you accept on behalf of your school, this olivine stone that was gathered by Mark on the day of our arrival at KK, to be on permanent loan to your school, in hopes that it may inspire many more to follow the path to knowledge and wisdom." As Missy said this, Rick came forward with a wood and glass box that displayed the rock, along with a plaque identifying it by serial number, sol date, birth date and location it was found. A second plaque bore the emblems of the two ships, as well as the engraved signatures of the crew. Rick handed it off to Missy, who leaned forward and gave it to KK. "If you look around, maybe someday you will find the other half of it," Missy said. KK looked, thought for a moment about the color and general shape, then on realizing the dual meaning of Missy's words, remembered seeing the very same rock in storage at KSC, and grinned big enough to make a cat disappear. Each graduate's name was read by an assistant principal, and as they crossed the stage the principal handed them their diplomas and the grads entered a gauntlet of 9 sets of hands to shake. KK got hugs instead. For the next several days, by plan, the crew hung out in Hawaii, basically vacationing, only this time with KK and her family as their tour guides. One evening the hotel hosted a luau, and KK pointed out she had never been to one as it wasn't something natives really did, it was more for tourists. Still, everyone had a great time, and it was there that a long-running bet with the crew was finally settled. "So you start at the Air Force Academy in a couple weeks, right?" Rick asked. "No, Annapolis, tell them," KK. Missy smiled, knowing that was not her choice either. "Actually, well, I don't want to upset anyone, but, well, I really liked all of the schools I visited and it was I'm starting Stanford in August," she finally said. "Hells yes." Beth said, "Go Beth, go Beth, go Beth," she sang as she pumped her fists in the air. "But I'm going to do grad school at Caltech." "Fuck yes." Missy shouted. "In your face Cardinals," Mindy announced with glee. Once their lives calmed down, Mark, Mindy, Beth moved into a ranch on farmland an hour's drive from Houston where Mark, using his book advance, had built a mansion. Missy built next door but ended up just moving in too. They were quiet about their situation, and no one outside the crew ever asked. Beth left NASA and became more reclusive, just running her company. Mindy stayed with NASA doing PR and training work along with Mark, and they continued to do film work with KK at a distance. Missy also stayed with NASA but retired from the military and went into mission planning and training. Alex received a permanent placement to NASA from the SR and continued his research, now with his family in Houston with him. Rick and Anna began training for AS-4 and V respectively. Missy was one of their main instructors. Chris and Donna stayed as consultants to NASA but took positions at a nearby med school as instructors, doing hospital rotations as well. They would marry about a year after the return from space, and their daughter arrived just a few months after Beth gave birth to Mark Jr. Mindy had Melissa Elizabeth just a few weeks after that. Missy had a son, named after both her and Mark's fathers, about 6 months after the Beck's child arrived. All the kids would grow up together and felt love and adoration from multiple parents. It wasn't the relationship that any of them wanted, but it was the one they had, and it worked. Mark doted on all the kids, and the women in his life, and none of them ever got tired of each other. They had their ups and downs but lived happily ever after. Epilogue. It had been almost 3 years since their return, and life had a rhythm that was pleasing to all at the ranch. The crew stayed close and didn't really venture outside each other as far as developing friendships. Irene thought this isolation was unhealthy, but any efforts at getting them back into the community had failed. It wasn't that they didn't like and enjoy meeting people, it was that they had no singular point of reference with anyone else. Still, all but Beth were involved with NASA in one or more ways and worked harmoniously with others. It was hard to say it was a problem, but it was out of the ordinary, and Irene watched for issues to develop that never did. AS-4 was scheduled to depart SpaceX Discovery at 15:38 Houston time that afternoon. Rick and his new crew had launched from KSC 2 days previous and stowed the last of their personal gear that night. The ship was stocked, inventoried and ready for its 14-month mission. They would spend 60 days on Mars before returning. Mark and Missy were expected to be in mission control and act as Capcoms for the launch, although the flight director would be the official Capcom and they would just talk on a private channel. Both were looking forward to it, although they both thought Rick was an idiot for going back. Marissa would also be there, along with the kids, and would live at the spare house that Missy had built at the ranch for the duration of the mission. Beth's company jet would be available to fly both Marissa and Rick's families in for visits, and everyone there would dote on the kids. It would work. The problem was it was intern selection day, and Mark hated selecting interns. Specifically, he hated having an intern. His first, appointed shortly after the crew's return from Houston, was given to him from Annie's PR department where he was partially assigned. She was interning for the year as opposed to the summer ones, which weren't as bad in Mark's opinion, and it became clear early on that her goal was to write a memoir about Mark. Mark already had a memoir and didn't want another, so she was canned. The previous year, he avoided having one, which made the educational outreach people irate as most of the ones applying were doing so in hopes of working with the AS-3/VCI crews. This year the hammer was dropped. Mark would have one, and he would help pick them. And they would be an annual rather than seasonal. He had been given reports compiled from their applications which removed any information that might identify them individually, so all it had was their academic credentials, but not what school. It gave an overall opinion of their schools and all were highly rated in their specific majors. An affidavit was attached to each, signed to show they understood false information would be prosecuted as fraud, but their actual signatures were redacted. It was a truly blind system, so one could claim favoritism or special considerations, but it left a lot to be desired in what to expect from the actual intern. Mark reviewed the stack of 20 or so with Annie watching him to make sure he did it. He had already said he wanted no communications or marketing majors or writers, only botany and engineering majors. He might be willing to consider another hard science, but there were enough applicants to satisfy his request. They all looked the same, except one that was buried in the middle. This person reported some work with an aerospace group, in a media setting, but was an aeronautical engineering major with a 4.0 from a top-ranked school. They had done a summer internship the year before at Ames. He would have rejected it just for the media experience, but there was something about it. He looked at the signature line. Even though it was just a big black market. The line. It was broken up like the copier had not been able to make a complete line that thin except. He studied it further while Annie watched, then without looking at the others said this one. Hire her. Mark, you should look at the rest, then we need to interview the top 3 or so for. Nope. This one, I don't need to look further. Send the rest to other departments, they are in the auditorium. Yes, the plan is for each department to interview their top picks, then we will decide. Let's go. We can tell her ourselves, Mark said as he got up, and Annie followed, protesting that as usual he wasn't following the program. How do you know it's a her anyway? There is nothing about gender on there, Annie exclaimed, to which Mark just smiled and stared. The auditorium was just on the other side of the building and down one floor, so Mark didn't have to listen to Annie's protests very long. Entering from the back of the room so that all the applicants were facing away from him, Mark asked. Applicant C4-21, why do you want to work here? I think it's the next step. I want a career here and... Okay, you're hired, he announced as the room turned to face him and all realized who he was. I am. KK asked as she turned, finally recognizing Mark's voice. Of course, but your lords and ladies of Mars are going to kill you for taking off a year from school. Mark smiled. I get credit for it, she squealed as she ran to him and they hugged. Come on, I'll show you where the office is and Annie can get your paperwork. The rest of you, well, you'll be interviewed, and from what I've seen of your CVs, I have no doubt we will find a spot for you. How did you know? Annie asked once they were back in the elevator going to Mark's office. You can't tell anyone. If you do and KK doesn't get it, I leave too. Okay, Annie finally promised, realizing that Mark was dead serious. The signature line, Mark said as Annie looked it over. The fuzzy breaks that look like a copier error. Our copiers would never do that, Mark explained. So. KK smiled, I knew you would get it, if you ever saw it. I heard from Missy you don't take in turns though, so. I don't. But this year, I'll make an exception, Mark smiled. So I start September 1st. 2nd. The 1st is Labor Day. Is that right, Annie? Gosh, I have to find an apartment, and get back to Stanford to pick up my Jeep and... No, you'll stay with the lords and ladies of Mars. There is plenty of room and you can ride to work with Mindy and me. When is your flight back? Tonight. I didn't expect to get. Cancel it. Beth has a jet from Digital Hermetics and her folks are visiting and will fly back in a couple days, she won't mind. You're going to drive back? Yeah, I have a Jeep now, Wrangler ragtop, 6-speed stick 4x4. You'll love it. Sounds like a road trip, think a few of us could come back with you. Well, I have some luggage and... That would fit on a plane, and we can rent another car. Road trip. Road trip. KK exclaimed. KK used her cell in Mark's office to call home and tell them the news, while Annie retrieved a new employee package. Mark kept the girls on a conference call speed dial, so he was able to call Missy, Mindy and Beth at the push of a button. Hey guy. What's up? You're on the speaker in the Canyon. We're coming in for the launch. The folks are at home with the kids, Beth answered. Oh great, what's your ETA? Oh, 20 minutes if the traffic holds up. Good deal, swing by my office, I just hired a new intern I want you to meet, she is going to stay with us, at least until we get her sorted out, but I told her you might be willing to give her a flight back to Kayla with your folks. Okay Mark, but... It was hard to tell Missy and Mindy apart when they were yelling on the phone, but one of them practically screamed. Mark Watney, you do not need to bring any more women out here. I can't believe you would spring this on. Whoa. It's not like that, I think you will really like her, calm down. She goes to Beth's old school, majoring in aeronautical engineering, pretty as a princess and sharp as a tack. What's your name again, dear? He grinned as he switched the phone to speaker. Watney, they heard just as KK began to speak. Kalina Akina, but my friends just call me KK. Sometimes my best friends call me Princess. There was a long silence before Mindy spoke. Watney, we are going to make you sorry for that stunt, in ways you can't yet imagine. KK, you are always welcome, We're all so happy we... Congratulations KK. If you are working with Mark we will teach you all the best ways to keep him in line, Beth shouted. I'm just, so happy. KK, there have been some things we couldn't talk about before, well we will tell you all that tonight. You're staying with us. We have plenty of room. We will be there soon, don't leave, don't move. Can't wait to see ya. Missy added. The women arrived just as Annie returned with KK's employment paperwork. They helped her fill it out and it was a joyous reunion for all. Everyone had stayed in touch with KK, but this was the first time they had seen her since she started Stanford, so there was a lot of catching up to do. Later at Mission Control, all wished Rick and Oz farewell over a private channel while the crew was going once again through the launch checklist. Missy would be one of the regular Capcoms in rotation, Mindy and Mark would be filling in some too, but today, Mission Control and Mission Command would be fulfilling that role. For now, they were just talking to fill some time before launch. Hermes Actual, this is Capcom 1, copy. Copy Capcom 1, Hermes Actual, your voice is familiar, have we met? Although her transmission was voice only, Missy could see his smile on the screen and knew Rick was in good spirits. As a matter of fact, we have. This is Melissa Lewis. They made me Capcom 1 so I could keep an eye on you. Godspeed Colonel Martinez and the crew of Oz 4. Oh, the places you'll go. You have a few others here that want to say hi. Copy that, Capcom. I stand on your shoulders. If I'm half the commander you are, I'll be good. Hermes Actual, Capcom 2. You're going to be great, we all have complete faith in you, Mindy said. Capcom 2, Hermes Actual. Thanks, and thanks for looking after Marissa and the kids, tell them I'll be home soon. Much sooner than the last time. It was Mark's turn next. Hermes Actual, Capcom 3. Good luck, you'll be fine. And don't get a scratch on my ride, I'll know if you do. Hey, did you get visas from the Martian ambassador? Capcom 3, Hermes Actual. From what I understand you pretty well wrecked your ride already. No to the visas, I hope they will let us land. He laughed. Copy that, Hermes, tell ya what, the ambassador is standing right here. Maybe she will get your visa expedited if you ask really nice. Mark grinned as he handed his headset to KK. You remember how to do it? Yeah, KK said as she grinned. Hermes Actual, this is KK. You're going to be fine. I will process your visas personally. Bring us back some big rocks and stuff, okay? Hey, I'm interning with Mark for the next year, I just found out today, so let's stay in touch, alright? Looks like you have a great crew again. Copy that, princess. You're interning with Mark. Remember, you can't believe anything he says. Get Commander Lewis and the crew to give you the real stories. Copy that, Hermes. KK out. Beth, Donna, Alex, Anna and Chris want to say hi. While the rest of the crew talked to Rick and wished him well, Annie finally had a chance to talk to Mark again. Yes. I can't believe you noticed that. The signature line, she smiled. No one looks for Morse code anymore. It's a dying art. The end.